Hi, so this is the first time I'm doing this. Let's see how it goes. I'm just going to read from where we left off, and we'll just go from there. Guess we should do a recap. Casey might have just found out she's gonna die. The elf chick is dying, and Nick and Theron just both showed up at her bookstore and killed some demons, and they're gonna take her to Argolia. So this is after, or during, mostly after the fight with the demons in the bookstore. They set fire. Let's just start again. They'd set her store on fire. Casey found herself being pushed into the back of an enormous SUV while she struggled to look back at the destruction that had once been her grandmother's pride and joy. Her chest tightened until it was hard to get air, and she knew it wasn't just from adrenaline or smoke. The one place she thought she had fit in was gone, now engulfed in flames. Nick slid into the driver's seat while Theron wedged himself into the back with her. Both men were so big. They seemed to suck up all the air in the vehicle, and had she not already been on the edge of freaking out, just that alone would have been enough to send her into a tailspin. All four door locks clicked at the same time as Casey turned to watch the building burn. "Oh my God, they set my building on fire." "Hurry," Theron exclaimed, gasping in the front passenger seat and turning around to look behind them. "They're coming." Fury erupted in Casey's chest as the SUV engine roared. She slammed her fist into Theron's shoulder. "You son of a bitch! You burned down my store!" The SUV jerked away from the curb with a force that sent Casey sprawling against Theron's massive chest. He grabbed her by the wrists and easily subdued her with one hand, holding her with the other to make sure she didn't fall to the floorboards in the car. The floorboards in the car. "Assuming we get out of here, you'll thank us later. Only a fire can destroy a demon's body." Like she cared about that now. Everything she'd worked so hard for the last few months was gone. The sky chose that moment to unleash its misery on the small town of Silver Hills, and a torrent of rain pummeled the vehicle, slashing against the SUV as if Mother Nature were good and pissed as they rocketed down the empty street. Casey clawed at Theron to let her go, but he just held on tighter. Nick drove like a bat out of hell. What is a bat out of hell? Do bats fly very quickly out of hell? Are there a lot of bats in hell? He shouted something at Theron Casey didn't catch, but Theron lifted her to his side and reached into his pocket. Before she saw what was in his hand, he'd rolled down the window and tossed the object behind them. A fireball erupted on the road at their backs, followed by howls and shouts, the kind Casey only imagined could come from hell. And that's when she realized those things back at her store were still following them, or rather, that new ones had joined the fight. They weren't out of trouble yet, not by a long shot. She gave up struggling and instead clamped onto Theron's shirt, drawing the cotton between her fists as Nick drove at breakneck speed out of town and into the forest beyond. Hopefully they're still on the road. Her adrenaline spiked as the reality of the situation sank in. Then she closed her eyes and said every prayer she knew that they'd get out of this alive. She didn't let go of Theron's shirt, even when he shifted back to lean against the seat again. And she didn't fight his hand on her spine or his arms gathering her close, when any sane person would have. Okay, it made her out to be a weakling, but she didn't care. Her store was gone, and some freaky monsters were following them. Considering everything she'd been through with Jill that morning, her nerves were at the end of the line. What did happen with Jill that morning? I wonder if she'll ever tell us. All things considered, she'd take a moment of comfort wherever she could get it, even from him. "I think we lost them," Theron said, glancing over his shoulder. Nick harumphed from the front seat. "Where are you taking us?" Theron asked into the silence after they'd been driving for a while. To her home," Nick said. "They'll find her there." "How?" "Because they're here for her." Casey didn't imagine the silence that followed, or the tension between the two men in the car with her. And though she didn't know how, she understood these two knew each other from somewhere, or knew of each other, and neither was happy with that knowledge. Nick jerked the car to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. She was thrown forward and back. Where's her seat belt? That is just not safe. But Theron held on to her tight. She goes nowhere without me, Theron reiterated as the car idled. I was sent here to protect her. I want nothing to do with you or the others. So help me gods, Nick bit out. If you're lying, I'm not. Silence hung like a dark, thick cloud in the car. Casey didn't dare move. She sensed these two were at a virtual standoff, and if she wasn't careful, she'd get caught in the middle. What could go down between them would put the battle back at her store to shame. Finally, Nick swore in a language Casey didn't recognize, and then the car whipped a Yui in the middle of the road. Theron braced a hand on the seat in front of him, because he's not wearing a seatbelt either. It's probably not big enough for how big he is. As they rocketed back down the road and made a sharp 90-degree turn onto a dirt road leading off into the trees. A road Casey'd never noticed before. This doesn't change anything, Argonaut, Nick ground out. I wouldn't want it to. Nick huffed and accelerated. Dust kicked up behind them. In a few minutes you may be wishing you never set eyes on her. Asterisk. A strong hand shook Casey from sleep. She wasn't sure how long she'd been out or how far they'd driven, but when she pried her eyelids open and pushed off Theron's chest, she didn't recognize her surroundings. Nick was already out of the SUV and opening her door. She eased out of the vehicle and stumbled on the battered road. Theron caught her from behind before she went down. Easy. She may have been weak and tired from everything that had happened, but she didn't want to look it in front of him. While she accepted Theron's comfort in the car, her brain was starting to function again, and until she got some answers, she didn't want or need his help. No, you can't even walk, but you don't need nobody. She tugged her arm from Theron's grasp and glanced around. The road, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a section of dirt that came to an abrupt end. Towering trees and dense underbrush surrounded them from nearly every side. In a brusque tone, Nick said, "Wait here," and climbed into the car and backed it into the shrubs until it disappeared from sight. A few moments later he reappeared, gesturing with his shoulder. "From here, we walk." Nick took the lead, blazing a trail through the forest. They're literally going on a camping trip in the middle of this epic disaster. Casey followed close behind, watching where he stepped, careful not to look anywhere but where she was walking. She was still shaky, a little unsure on her feet, and the last thing she needed was to fall on her ass in front of these two. Theron was a commanding presence at her back, close enough to touch and smell. Hope it's a good smell. Why wouldn't he back off? And why did he unnerve her so much, especially now? In her mind, she was still working through everything that had happened, but one thing was glaringly clear. Theron had come back for her. He said those demons were looking for her, which meant he knew what they wanted. It also meant he hadn't come looking for her because he wanted to pick up where they'd left off. Namely, in case we forgot, the hot, wicked sex she'd been fantasizing about since he ditched her ass for greener pastures. Bastard. The path rose in elevation until Casey's breath came fast and shallow. That's what happens when you go hiking. She wished desperately they could stop, just for a minute, long enough so she could catch her breath, but she wasn't about to ask. She had a strange sense Nick was intent on getting them to their destination fast. And that thought made her brain work itself right back around to what they were running from in the first place. She lifted her head once to glance around, and in the process stumbled on a stone that was in the way. Her hand darted out to grasp the base of a tree to her right, but she never made contact. In one fell swoop, she was lifted off her feet and cradled against Theron's massive chest. They do a lot of that, sleeping off feet and cradling young women. It just doesn't happen. But they're huge. "Let me down," she snapped. "I can walk just fine." "Not like that, you can't. You're as pale as snow." Snow. Really pale. When she wriggled against him, his grip only tightened under her arms and beneath the backs of her knees. Stop biting me, or we'll both go down. If you think I'm going to let you touch me after what you did—" The rest of her protest rushed out of her mouth on a screech when he tossed her over his shoulder so her hands were shooting down his muscular back for balance, and her ass was sticking straight up in the air. "This works better for me as well, Melly." Both of his arms held her legs locked together against his chest in a vice. "And the view is more appealing." Heat rushed to Casey's cheeks, followed by disbelief at his gall. "Why, you—" "What's the problem back there?" Nick asked from ahead of them. "No problem," Theron called. "The cage is just a little wobbly. We've got it covered." Traumatic experience or not, this guy didn't speak for her. Casey opened her mouth to lay into him, only to be cut off by a warning rumble from the man holding her captive. "It would be wise to do as I say right now, Melly. I don't know where we're headed, and wrestling with you, while stimulating in its own right, is too much of a distraction." "The blood is rushing to my head, you jerk." "Good, it'll bring your color back. Of all the—" He chuckled and picked up his pace. With a huff, Casey blew the hair out of her eyes. Tossing insults with him wasn't getting her anywhere, and part of her was happy to be off her aching feet, though she'd never have admitted that to him in a million years. Frowning, she relaxed against him, only to tense once more when his hand drifted up the back of her hamstring. She braced her hands on his lower back and pushed herself up. "Watch it, buddy." Just getting a better grip. Oh, she just bet. Before she could tell him what he could do with his hands, darkness overtook her, and she realized they'd stepped in some kind of cave or tunnel. Theron eased her down to the ground. Behind her, Nick said, "Not far now. Stay close and keep me in sight. Tunnels branch off in various directions. You'll be lost forever if you choose the wrong one." That didn't sound so appealing to Casey right now, who wanted nothing more than a warm bed, a stiff drink, and a chance to sleep this nightmarish day right out of her mind. She followed closely behind Nick, and knew after the first turn that if he weren't leading her, she'd be lost in an instant. What little light shone in from the opening quickly went out, and darkness pressed in as they made turn after turn. Casey reached out a hand to steady herself on the rock walls, the sense of earth tingling heavily in her nose. From ahead she saw a pinpoint beam of light, and realized Nick had pulled a flashlight from his pocket. Though the tunnel was tall enough for all three of them to stand in, the walls were close, and both men had to turn sideways to fit their broad shoulders through the space. After what seemed like an eternity of hairpin turns and rapid elevation changes that stole Casey's breath all over again, the tunnel finally opened into a massive cavern illuminated by hundreds of torches. Casey gasped as she blinked rapidly at the increase in light. 3-story wooden structures were built into the rock lining both sides of the cavern. Doors and windows and balconies looked out into a central pool of water, fed by a massive waterfall that fell from the ceiling of the cave nearly 100 feet above. That sounds wicked cool. "Oh my," she whispered. People milling around the central pool stopped to look their way as wary eyes peered down from the structures on both sides. She took a cautious step backward and ran smack into Theron's chest, but he didn't move. Those eyes staring down at her weren't the least bit friendly, and she had the wild impression that she'd just been thrown into the lion's den. A small child, no more than 5, broke free from a woman standing off to the side and raced toward them, yelling, "Nick! Nick!" Nick dropped to his knees to catch the child as she threw herself into his arms. Their hug was brief, but it was clear even to Casey that the two shared a special bond. That's weird and creepy. "I knew you'd come back okay," the girl said to him. In her hand she held a doll cradled to her chest. "Minnie told me." "Minnie's a smart girl," Nick said, chucking her under the chin and rising to his feet. The girl glanced briefly at Theron, standing at Casey's back, and turned her attention to Casey, and it was then Casey noticed the marks. The entire right side of the girl's face was covered in puckered scars, as though she'd been in some terrible car accident and then burned. Gruesome. Her right eye was covered by a patch, and hair that should have been long and thick was sparse on that side of her head. But it wasn't the girl's appearance that made Casey catch her breath as she looked down at the small child. It was the look in the girl's good-eyed. Like she'd seen the world and beyond, like she already lived a lifetime and aged eons beyond her years. Like she was looking straight through Casey and into a future no one knew but her. I knew you'd come, the girl said. Minnie told me. Who's Minnie? Casey found herself asking. The girl held up the doll. Minnie knows everything. She knew that Nick would battle the monsters today and win, and that he'd come home safe, and she knew he'd bring you here to save us. Casey glanced at Nick, who was staring at the girl with a perplexed expression. A chill of foreboding slid down Casey's spine. She returned her attention to the girl. What do you mean, save us? All of us. The girl held up her free hand and gestured behind her. The whole colony. Minnie said that's why you've come. Though it was completely insane, and made no sense whatsoever, considering everything else, two words pinged around Casey's brain. My people. She dropped to her knees in front of the girl without hesitation. What's your name? Marissa. Marissa, Casey repeated, eyes running over the small child. What else did Minnie tell you about me, Marissa? That you would come with him. She nodded toward Theron, standing close at Casey's back. And not to be afraid of him. She leaned in close to Casey's ears. But others don't understand that, not even Nick. But he's here to protect you, and you need him as much as we need you. Why? Casey whispered. Marissa pushed the doll into Casey's hands. Let Minnie show you. The moment Casey's fingers touched the girl's hand, a jolt shot through her, and suddenly she was soaring through time and space. Ooh. And standing on the edge of a great cliff, maybe it's the cliff of emotion, looking down at a horrific scene. Flames shot to the heavens, screams echoed above and beyond, and a great roar rose from a scuffle just beyond the fire. The youngster, Marissa, was hurt and bleeding. The flames engulfed her dress, searing her flesh. A woman was working to smother them, but couldn't get them out fast enough to save the child's delicate skin. Beyond them, the same monsters that had converged on Casey's store earlier in the day were devouring a man. Then Nick appeared on the scene and began battling the creatures, just as he had in her store. He was swift and efficient, and his strength and skill were mind-boggling. He saved the young girl and her mother, but the man was devoured before the child's eyes. And in horror Casey watched as the monster reached into the screaming man's chest and ripped out his heart. Ooh. The girl's hand on Casey's arm pulled her from the vision and back to the present, but the pain was still fresh and real in the youngster's good eye, and Casey felt it too. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What they'll do to you will be worse. Marissa! At the sound of a sharp female voice, Casey eased to her feet, more shaken than she wanted to admit. The woman who came running at breakneck speed was also burned and scarred, and she scooped Marissa up into her arms just before shooting Theron a scorching look and hurrying off to the village, speaking in a language Casey didn't understand. Casey's heart was beating a mile a minute as she looked up at Nick, but if she had expected answers on his hard face, it was clear she was on her own. His amber eyes were narrowed and focused directly on her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Marissa is a soothsayer, Nick mumbled. A seer. She uses Minnie, her doll, as a medium, but she senses happenings in the future without her. Okay, that didn't help any, because somehow Casey knew what she'd seen hadn't been the future, but the past. Casey let out a nervous laugh that held absolutely no humor. Ha! Well, this time she's wrong. She's obviously mistaken about me. I can barely save myself, let alone anyone else. Theron and Nick exchanged confused glances, and weird, clairvoyant child or not, Casey decided it was time for some answers. She squared her shoulders. Just what's going on here, Nick? What were those things back there, and where the hell are we? She looked Theron's way. And where on earth did you really come from? She glanced between the two mammoth men again as panic edged its way into her voice. It's about time someone started talking, or I'm walking. Nick's eyes settled on Theron. I think it's about time we all got some answers. Oh. I think it's about time we all got some answers. But not here in front of the others. We'll do this in the lodge. Storytime. That's it for chapter 12.